The gentleman from Texas yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden. 5 minutes for
Thank you,
opening
Mr.
statement,
Chairman.
please.
Appreciate your holding the hearing on these important issues and the long overdue reforms needed at FDA to improve efficiency and update their framework for regulating over-the-counter drug products. Following the successful 5-year reauthorization of several of FDA's critical medical device user fee programs, there's no better time to continue our work than now and in this space, and I'm pleased with the bipartisan effort that's already begun. From cough and cold medicines to antiperspirants and antacids, pharmacy aisles and medicine cabinets are filled with over-the-counter or OTC drugs that American consumers rely upon daily. Unfortunately, the regulatory process, as we've heard, has been the same since the 70s. And while bell-bottom pants, I see, are coming back, we need to. It's remarkable, isn't it? We need to innovate in this sector, and safety-related changes often take years to implement. Simply unacceptable. Fortunately, FDA, regulated industry, patient, consumer groups all agree that significant reform is something we all need to join hands on. For several years now, they've engaged in productive conversations about how to substantially improve upon the status quo. Informed by this ongoing dialogue, we now have bipartisan resolution before us today that will ensure Americans have more timely access to innovative, safe, and effective OTC medicines. Consumers will no longer have to wait years for an inflexible rulemaking process to wind its way through the bureaucracy before benefiting from product improvements. So I really want to thank our colleagues, Mr. Latta, Mr. Gett, Mr. Guthrie, Ms. Dingell, as well as Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, my colleague Mr. Pallone, and others who have put their shoulder to the wheel on this one. We've proven time and again in this committee we know how to legislate in a bipartisan way and get good things done for the American consumers. We're going to do it again here. And with that, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, the remainder of my time.
Well, I thank the chairman for yielding, and I also thank Chairman Burgess for holding today's hearing on this very important issue. I also want to thank our witnesses for being with us today to provide the insight on this topic and on the legislation. As already been said, over-the-counter medicines are in nearly every household across our nation. Yet despite widespread utilization, the system in place to regulate these drugs has been outdated for decades. It's time to move forward to a more flexible framework that will spur innovation, expand consumer choice, and better address potential safety concerns. I believe the discussion draft before us today will achieve these goals and provide predictability to the drug approval process. The OTC Monograph Safety Innovation Reform Act is the product of a bipartisan collaboration between myself, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Burgess, Ranking Member Green, Ms. DeGette, Vice Chairman Guthrie, and Ms. Dingell, as well as significant contributions from the FDA and the industry. I'd like to thank all those involved who worked tirelessly on this effort in order to increase consumer choice and safety. I appreciate the chairman for allowing the opportunity to discuss the monograph reform and improve upon the proposal presented in the discussion draft today. I look forward to hearing today's testimony and receiving input from my colleagues on the subcommittee. I thank the chairman for holding today's hearing and for our witnesses, and I yield back. Oh, I'm sorry. And I yield to Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you for yielding the chairman's time. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this important hearing today and examine the review process of over-the-counter drugs. This important bill would enable greater innovation and foster FDA efficiencies within the approval process of over-the-counter drugs, something that has not been done since the 1970s. And I want to specifically thank Congressman Latta for his leadership on this issue. I'm proud to be a lead co-sponsor with Congressman Latta and several of my colleagues of this important bipartisan bill, which industry, FDA, and the committee staff have worked so hard to move forward. I strongly believe this legislation will help every American, as these products are the first in line of defense against common ailments. And Dr. Woodcock, I always appreciate you being here, and I thank our other witnesses who will follow for being here as well today. If there's no one else wanting Chairman Walden's time, I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you also for holding today's hearing on the over-the-counter drug monograph reform and the establishment of over-the-counter monograph user fee program. And I also want to commend our Ranking Member Green, Representative DeGette, Latta, Guthrie, and Dingell, as well as the chairman of the full committee, for your work in crafting a proposal that will accomplish these goals. The safety and effectiveness of over-the-counter drugs is established today through conformance with a monograph. This so-called rule book outlines the conditions of use for a particular drug ingredient that outlines the dosage form, patient population, labeling and warnings, and other requirements. This rule book is established through a three-phase rulemaking process that is oftentimes inflexible and time-consuming, making it difficult for FDA to quickly revise or update monographs in response to safety or other issues. We've also heard from FDA and industry that the monograph process does not lend itself well to evolving science and technology and may have the unintended effect of discouraging the development of new formulations. Not only is it clear that regulatory reform is needed, but the current program is drastically under-resourced. So today, the OTC Monograph program oversees more than 100,000 products with a staff of 30 people and a budget of just over $8 million. It's my hope that through regulatory reform and increased predictable resources, we can streamline the over-the-counter process to allow for swift finalization of current monographs, timely updates, and encourage innovation where possible. And while we're beginning the process of making significant improvements in the review of over-the-counter products, I had hoped that we would begin taking action today on cosmetics. Millions of Americans use cosmetic products every day, but FDA's regulatory authority over cosmetics is woefully inadequate. In just the last year, millions of women and children have been exposed to shampoos that can cause extraordinary hair loss, lip balm that can cause blistering and rashes, and eye shimmer tainted by asbestos. Unfortunately, FDA does not have the authority today to hold these manufacturers responsible and has very little ability to ensure that these cosmetics are safe. And this simply can't continue. And as we move forward with this process, we should provide adequate resourcing and authority for cosmetics as well. And I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues, the FDA, industry, and other stakeholders to accomplish both of these goals and ensure that continued availability and safety of the millions of drug products and personal care products people use every day. So I'd like to yield the time that I have left to Ms. Dingle.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Americans deserve peace of mind in knowing that all drugs they take are safe and effective, whether it's a prescription drug or an over-the-counter drug. There are over 300,000 over-the-counter products on the market today, which Americans use in everyday life. Yet FDA's regulatory system for OTCs is completely broken. The agency has a meager budget of $8 million, which all of us keep saying over and over, and a cumbersome process that hinders the agency's ability to both address safety risks and let new and innovative products come to market. The draft legislation creates a new user fee system for the OTC products to give FDA the resources it needs to do its job of ensuring patient safety. It also allows the agency to move quickly to update and revise the monograph system through administrative orders rather than notice and comment rulemaking, which are similar to the reforms made under the Sunscreen Innovation Act. We've seen the benefits that user fees have brought to the regulation of prescription drugs and medical devices, and it's time to bring this system to the OTC space as well. And while I'm very pleased that we're holding this hearing and moving forward with the OTC legislation, I want to commend Mr. Pallone for the same comments made about the cosmetic industry, which is also would desperately benefit from single reforms, and hope the committee will soon move forward with legislation establishing a user fee program for these products. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Latta, Green, Burgess, Guthrie, and DeGette, for working with me on this draft legislation, and look forward to continuing our work together to reach consensus on this important issue. And as always, our chairman and ranking minority member are supportive. I yield back the balance of my time.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. This concludes member opening statements, and the chair would remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. And we do want to thank our witnesses for being here with us this morning, for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by questions from members. Today we will start with our first panel and hear from Dr. Janet Woodcock, the Director of Food and Drug Administration's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. We appreciate you being here this morning, Dr. Woodcock. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Thank you. We're here to talk about modernizing the Monograph system for OTC drugs. Probably everyone in this room has used an OTC drug at one time or another, an OTC monograph drug, in fact. I know I have. These medicines allow us to manage minor health problems without going and consulting a health professional, to manage them on our own. And millions of Americans use these products every day. They're widespread, and I believe there's more exposure of Americans to these OTC monograph drugs than there is to prescription drugs in this country. And the monograph system allows manufacturers to come on the market without the burdensome per product application process that we use for generics or for new drugs. So this is a much simplified system. So why the push for reform? Well, as the members have already said, the monograph process was put in place a long time ago to deal with the hundreds of thousands of products on the market after Congress passed the 62 amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, requiring drugs on the market to show that they were effective. And so FDA had to deal with that in some way. And since many of the OTC products were different versions of the same basic ingredients, FDA decided to deal with them in groups. And if it was found that X ingredient at Y dose and dosage form was effective for Z condition, okay, these facts would be put in a regulation, and any manufacturer could come on the market as long as they conformed to those conditions. Of course, these manufacturers were also subject to inspection and GMPs for their manufacturing, and that is still the case. But their problems emerged, as members have already said. The rulemaking process that was put in place has become lengthy and burdensome, and there are huge delays. There are 88 monographs that are not finalized. And it also means that we can't respond rapidly to safety issues. There was perhaps a naive thought at the time that science wouldn't evolve, our understanding wouldn't evolve, and that new safety issues wouldn't come up for these products that had already been marketed. But that is by no means the case. And we have really been hampered in responding rapidly to safety problems. And sometimes this leaves consumers unprotected. It may leave manufacturers open to liability. And then this process is frozen in 1972 and before. So it doesn't apply to anything later than that. So this is only still trying to deal with those products that were on the market at that time. So there's really nothing for innovation in this entire process. So the reform that we are proposing keeps the features of the monograph system that work well, which is products that follow the conditions could still be marketed without prior FDA approval if they conform to the conditions for marketing. And it's a public process, so the public has input, and it's an open and transparent process. But it streamlines this process by replacing rulemaking with administrative orders. So using an order system is very similar to what we do for new drugs or generic drugs, and it's quite appropriate for scientific decision-making. We would issue a proposed order under the discussion draft, allow public comment, and then issue a final order. And it provides due process, a hearing and appeal and hearing process to permit challenges to FDA's decisions, so that process is in place. But there are fewer requirements that have to do with rulemaking, so that this can be accomplished in a much speedier manner. It also would encourage innovation by expanding eligibility for the monograph and no longer limiting it to pre-72 type of products. So industry can request that we amend a monograph, or they could even submit new kinds of products. And what we envision allows for confidential meetings early in the process between industry and the FDA before we move into the public process to allow for that innovation to be explored. It also would allow, very importantly, FDA to quickly respond to urgent safety issues. So we could issue an interim final rule and definitively get that safety information out. Now that rule then would be subject to further public comment and discussion and so forth, but it would be in place during that time so that people could be protected quickly. And that's something we're really missing right now. And it would reduce the backlog of unfinished monographs by transferring these pending regulations and so forth by statute. And this would allow us to deal in an orderly and effective manner with all the pending work that has not been finalized up till this point. The public health, I think, also would be served if there were provision to clarify our authority to require certain types of packaging, such as unit dose packaging. This can protect people from taking too many pills. And we know that for our elderly and for children especially, they may mistake medicines for candy, they can overdose, and so that kind of protective packaging is very important. And this clarification would complement the authority of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which can require child-resistant closures on different packages, and we do conform to their standards for that. So all in all, this modernization proposal, along with the user fees that would provide the staff to enable to do it, I think would really benefit both the public, most importantly, public safety, and it would benefit the industry. And the FDA has been talking to many stakeholders about this over the last 3 or 4 years, and we feel the proposals that are on the table would really serve the public well. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, Dr. Woodcock, for your testimony, and we will move into the question and answer portion of the hearing. I am going to begin by yielding my time to the principal author of the bill, Mr. Latta, recognized for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the chairman for yielding, and Dr. Woodcock, thanks very much for being with us today. We appreciate your testimony and the work that you've been doing at FDA. If I could start with the first question, maybe kind of touching on what you were just discussing. As we worked together to draft this legislation, we were very mindful to ensure that FDA has the authority they need to regulate the safe packaging of over-the-counter drugs to prevent unintended consequences, as you were talking, such as children that accidentally would ingest drugs intended for adults. Does the discussion draft, again, just to go back into it again, does the discussion draft provide FDA with sufficient authority? And would you also discuss the authorities you would be granted when the monograph reform becomes law and their benefits to public safety? If you could touch back into that, please.
Certainly. Well, first, we believe the language that said an administrative order may include requirements for the packaging of a drug, which may include requirements for unit dose packaging to encourage use in accordance with labeling. Such packaging requirements that we could have could include unit dose packaging and special requirements for products intended for use by children and other appropriate requirements. And we believe that language provides us enough authority to require safe packaging.
Okay, thank you. Also, and a lot of us, when you look at the dates that we're looking at, in some cases, we're going back to 1972, and that the FDA began evaluating 26 therapeutic categories and has yet to finalize monographs for each of them. Could you go into, again, the system that we're looking at, especially with the review of the OTC, that it is slow, that it is antiquated, and again, speaking to the proposal before us today, how, especially under the administrative order process and procedure, that would be speeded up to get these drugs out there?
Certainly. So what occurs now, what you have in front of you, the first slide, talks about a single role, and this is an important one, external analgesic drug products. All right, and it shows many of the steps that we've gone through simply to try and move a single rulemaking along. And each one of those require very large administrative effort, writing, so many of them publishing in the Federal Register, a notice, going through extensive clearances. This would be substituted by a new process that would take less than 2 years and would have defined timelines under the user fee part of the program. So we would commit to finishing things in a timely manner, all right? And what we would do for these old ones, some of them would transition to legally marketed drugs, and that would, over time, go through a process where the industry would submit data, the old monograph issues would be taken off the table, they'd submit current data, and we would have timelines within which we would review that, publish, a draft, and then finalize an order. And the reason we wouldn't just go to an approval like we do for a new drug, right, or a generic drug, would be this is a public process. And so if we publish a draft, that allows anyone who might be interested in commenting, right, and participating in that to comment before we finalize. So there is a different, slightly additional step compared to approving a new drug, because once that order is final, then any manufacturer who wishes may enter the market if they conform to those conditions. But we do it directly and would do it directly instead of through publishing regulations. And the current regulations would go off the books.
Yeah, and I wish that this slides were working right now, because what you've given us on this, when you have the burdensome multi-step process in the rulemaking, we're looking at the first that was December the 4th, 1979, and there's 22 different dates on here.
Yes.
We get down to November the 19th, 1997. So we got to get this sped up, and we appreciate the work that you've been doing, and we look forward to getting this bill passed. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for yielding, and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks. The gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Woodcock. You're always good to see you, and we appreciate the good work you've done for many years and at the FDA. I want to start by asking you about the current OTC monograph system. The committee learned a bit about how the system works or doesn't work during our consideration of the Sunscreen Innovation Act.
Yes.
Well, it was clear then and even more clear now that reforms to modernize and fund FDA OTC monograph activities are needed to better serve patients, consumers, and the industry. You just elaborated on how monograph rulemaking takes too long and is an inefficient process for scientific decisions, and how the lack of speed and flexibility poses harm to patient safety. How will allowing the FDA to make scientific determinations on OTC ingredients through the administrative order process improve overall patient safety and allow for new innovations?
I brought a little visual aid with me as an example, okay? Some time ago, and this relates to the fact that with the rulemaking, you assume something is fixed, but there's always new scientific knowledge with drugs, right? And we need to get that out there to patients. We discovered that acetaminophen, a common pain reliever and fever reducer, all right? Some people are allergic and have life-threatening skin reactions, and we wanted to put a warning on. So what we did, we couldn't modify the rule quickly, right? You see that? So what we did, we put out a drug safety communication in August of 2013 discussing 91 cases that had associated with 12 deaths. And the allergy alert for severe skin reaction, we put March 2014. So now if you look at Tylenol, okay, and you look at the label of it, it has this allergy statement on there and warning, so people know. If you look at others that you can get, perhaps smaller manufacturers who aren't aware of this, we issued guidance on how to do this labeling, but this does not have a safety label on it. And we issued a final guidance, a draft guidance in November of 2014, a final guidance in January of 2017. Most sponsors voluntarily complied because that's all we could ask, because it's it's different than the regulation, if you follow me. So this is a OTC NDA drug. This is a monograph drug, and it still is out there without the warning. And that is the case for many products. Most problematically, I think, are the pediatric cough and cold, where the manufacturers, we've had to get them to voluntarily comply. We know, and Congress has passed several laws around studying pediatric drugs, right? And yet, the Monograph system and all those old rules we made assume that children are like little adults and that their dosing can just be extrapolated. And so to change all that could take 10 years or more in regulation.
And thank you. The Monograph reform can will streamline the process, but it won't address the resource challenges that the agency faces. As you know in your testimony, the FDA struggles to meet the requirements of congressional mandates, keep pace with the science, and meet public health needs for Monograph products in a timely fashion for current resource levels. The FDA has a budget of about $8 million and 30 full-time employees to oversee a $32 billion industry through one of the most complex regulatory frameworks the agency has.
Right.
Can you elaborate on how a reform without user fees is utterly unworkable?
Yes, well, we've had some reform in the Sunscreen Innovation Act that Congress passed several years ago. Right now, our resources are completely taken up by implementing the Sunscreen Innovation Act. We are under court order for certain deadlines for other monographs, and we have to pay attention to that. And then the acute safety issues that we're dealing with. We literally have no other resources. So even were we given additional authorities or different ways of implementing, we would have a great deal of trouble bringing that about without additional resources.
Mr. Chairman, I only have 12 seconds left, but I know the FDA stakeholders and the members work together on this, and I think we had a good example of this subcommittee doing PDUFA over the years since, 1992, and to have this funding ability for the FDA to be able to not only have the authority, but can actually regulate and oversee it. And so I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton. 5 minutes for questions, please.
I thank you, the subcommittee chairman. Dr. Woodcock, how long have you been at the FDA?
30 years?
30 years.
Yes.
How many monographs have been approved in the time you've been there?
Probably 7.
Well,
Maybe, we don't know, but that'd be a reasonable ballpark.
now, I know you're not personally responsible for this, but I graduated from college in 1972, 45 years. I've had 2 wives, 4 children, 6 grandchildren, been approved 17 times to be a member of Congress and disapproved once to be a senator. Do you think 7 monographs in 45 years is acceptable?
No, I mean, obviously, for each monograph, there's been a great deal of activity, all right? Scientific.
I can go outside and yell and scream and cause a stir and have a lot of activity, but that doesn't pass a law.
Yes,
I mean, I know it's not your personal problem.
right.
I wasn't aware of this until I read the briefing. But, you know, if the system is broken, which obviously is Congressman Latta just pointed out, my gosh, does it take 45 years for the FDA to say, help, we need help? I mean this, when you're trying to find a cure for cancer and all the other great things, I don't know that this is the most important priority at the FDA. I wouldn't say that. But approving a monograph for manufacture of over-the-counter drugs shouldn't take a moonshot.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, and we could do it under the new proposals that have been proposed. We can, I think, do this in a more timely manner. It's simply going through regulations and doing regulations is...
Well, but I mean, again, somebody in your agency has known for a long, long time this is a problem. A long, long time. I mean, I never chaired the health subcommittee, but I did chair the full committee. I've been on the committee for 32 years. Nobody ever came to me from the FDA and said, hey, we got a problem here. I mean, don't you know, Mr. Latta says that to approve a specific new drug, you have an average of 18 FTE reviewers working on that. But to do all of these monographs, you've only got 18 people reviewing them.
That's right.
Don't you think somebody at some point in time in your position or somebody that reports to you could have said, maybe we need a few more people, maybe we need a lot of people, maybe we need to change the rules, maybe you don't need 27-step processes. I mean, I would assume that the FDA supports the Latta, DeGette, Green bill. Is that?
That's true.
Okay.
And we held a public meeting 3 years ago to discuss the problem, and we were very clear that the system was progressively becoming more unworkable as it was more and more difficult to get regulations through. Now, the industry is very concerned about these safety problems, but earlier, because all these drugs remained on the market until a monograph was finalized and perhaps some of them would be taken off, it wasn't such a problem for the industry. But in the modern world, it is, industry, I believe, supports this.
Well, what in your mind is a reasonable time to get these monographs approved?
Right, I believe for a public process, several years and should be done.
2 years?
Yes.
Does the bill, is that the guideline in the bill? 2 years? Do we know? Anybody? Okay, well, if it's not, I'll put it in the bill.
Yeah, but we aren't going to be able to do every single one at the same time in 2 years, okay?
I understand that.
We're going to have to, and we can talk about that, we will have to build up our staff, our infrastructure, IT systems, and so forth.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to testify on this, and I commend the subcommittee chairman and the sponsors of the bill. Hopefully, it won't take us 45 years to move the bill, Mr. Chairman, and we can have a bill signing ceremony and then hold them to their word that they'll start approving these in 2 years. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey. Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not trying to denigrate you, Dr. Woodcock, or Mr. Barton, and I'm certainly not going to get into how many years we've all been here, what we've been doing. But I think part of the problem is that, you know, you're not allowed to initiate that. I mean, you can't write us letters and say you need more resources, you want to change the law. That's our oversight obligation. And so, you know, I would say that whether it's Democrat or Republicans in power, we still have to do a lot more oversight. It's not really up to you to come to us. It doesn't work that way, the way I understand it. But in any case, one of the most serious constraints of the current monograph system is the ability to move quickly to revise the monograph to address emerging safety issues. And the current multi-step monograph process requires the FDA to make any revisions or updates through a rulemaking process. And, you know, that's why these safety changes take so long, if they happen at all. So I want you, if you could, briefly discuss how emerging safety issues are addressed currently through the OTC drug monograph process, and what has prevented the agency thus far moving swiftly to address safety issues, such as those associated with the use of the cough and cold products in children, which you mentioned, actually.
Well, I believe our thinking has evolved on that since the cough and cold issue first came up. Because when it first came up, the thought was, well, the regulation says these are generally recognized as safe and effective, including for children. That's what it said in a government regulation. So what could we say? But it was clear that thinking had changed on children and that children should be specifically studied and the safety evaluated in children. So eventually what we do now is we issue safety communications and issue guidance on labeling and so forth, even though it is somewhat different than what might be in the in the regulation or the draft regulation or whatever state, the tentative final monograph, whatever state it is in. So we can do that, and that requires voluntary, as I said, participation by the industry. It's not binding on industry because it's guidance. And so I think everyone would prefer that safety changes we deal with safety problems are dealt with promptly and very definitively, not in guidance or something that's voluntary, so we can take care of the problem, keep people safe rapidly as we get the information.
Well, thank you. Now, in the discussion draft that we're considering, the monograph process would be transitioned from rulemaking to an administrative order process, and FDA would also be given expedited authority to update safety labeling information in light of serious adverse events. Will you explain how the transition to administrative order and to the expedited authority for safety labeling will help to respond to these emerging safety issues?
Well, the expedited safety labeling would be, say, an interim order whereby the FDA could put out an order rapidly, not subject to some of the public comment requirements and so forth that most orders would have. All right? And once that was out, it would be binding. It would be interim final, so it would be binding. So we would notify the public, and the manufacturers would have to change their label and conform their label to the safety problem. Then you could have comments after that, and we could discuss it more. But the safety issue would have been dealt with more definitively, so people were protected. Right now, it may take 8 years or more for us to get a rule change so that we can have new safety statements in the regulation.
All right, thanks. Just wanted to ask you, what lessons have been learned from PDUFA, GDUFA, that were incorporated into the Over-the-Counter Monogram Drug User Fee Act, and how will user fees benefit the OTC program industry and patients, for example?
Well, some of the things we learned is for this program, we're going to have what we call managed growth, is what we're have been discussing with everyone, where the program starts sort of small, expectations are clear for everyone, and it grows over time, and the user fees grow so that we can absorb and lay down the foundation. And we learned that from the generics program, where we had to change like a huge number of things at once. We also have learned that we should have as simple a fee structure as possible, with a few exceptions and tiers and all, because this is a very large industry. There are a very large number of players here and have all kind of different status. And the more exceptions and tiers and everything, maybe it'll start looking like the tax code.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky. Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. Thanks for being here today and discuss this important matter. I've heard stories where manufacturers trying to do the right thing have risked having a misbranded product because they want to update their label in real time, as the current process can take years, as Mr. Barton described. In order for a label or packaging change, currently manufacturers must go through notice and comment rulemaking, a bureaucratic system of red tape that can take years. So thanks for bringing this to us, and us working together to try to move this forward. But could you tell the committee how the administrative orders will ensure due process is maintained if there are differences of opinions, since this is a public process?
Right. Well, there will be an administrative order that's not final that comes out first. Then there will be a comment period. And that's because, since this is a public issue, other manufacturers who may not have been participating but may want to get into that space, or the public, consumers, advocates, whatever, may want to comment on the order. And so there's that public process whereby the comment. If we get substantive comments on the proposed order, then the time of finalization may be somewhat delayed as we deal with those issues, and we can do that in many ways. But that's a public process. And then there is a process that has been proposed for administrative appeal of decisions, right, through an appeal process within the Center for Drugs, all right, and then administrative appeal above that to a party who is a third party who is selected to hold a sort of hearing on it and adjudicate any substantive issue that's a material difference that might occur. So there are layers of administrative appeal and recourse for people.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned sunscreens earlier. Could you please expand on how sunscreens will and can fit into this over-the-counter drug reform? My good friend Ed Whitfield, who is a member of this committee, my colleague from Kentucky, former colleague, who's no longer in Congress, did a lot of work in this space and talked about it with him some. And so it just seemed, with the rise in skin cancer, it seems very difficult to get improved sunscreens on the marketplace. And so how will this work for sunscreens?
My understanding of the current draft is the Sunscreen Innovation Act will continue to operate, all right? So what was stipulated by Congress there, and we have met all the timeframes that were required under the Sunscreen Innovation Act. We have exceeded those timeframes, so those will continue to operate. Once those sunscreens that are subject to that are done and through the process, then they will be folded into the order so that then we have a common system. Now, one thing that remains a question, one of the innovations or improvements that's being proposed in this discussion for modernizing the whole monograph process is to have confidential meetings with manufacturers, an ability to do that. That is not part of the Sunscreen Innovation Act, so that could be put in to conform that act with if monograph reform is passed. Was I clear, or is this?
I believe so. I appreciate that. And those are my questions, and I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, I too would like to thank you for coming back again and giving us your testimony today. I'm very interested in the potential public health benefits of reforming the OTC medicine regulations. Your testimony today highlighted several examples of safety concerns with OTC medicines and how they were handled by your agency. How frequently does the FDA encounter adverse events with OTC medicines?
I would say fairly frequently. To rise to a serious level, maybe once every several years.
Infrequently? Frequently or infrequently?
Fairly frequently, but given what they are and the exposure of the population to them, but once perhaps every 2 years, we're facing an issue that we would like to get out rapidly to the public to notify them, and our hands are really tied, and we have to use this guidance process.
All right. Two of the examples that you highlighted in your written testimony were related to pediatric issues with certain medicines. Would you say that a disproportionate number of safety concerns with OTC medicines are related to pediatrics?
I would say in the last decade that is true, or decade or so. And the reason is, starting in the late 90s, I think everyone became aware that you should study children and not just treat them as tiny adults and just scale down the medicines. And so with that realization came the realization that children may be being harmed, because back in the 70s when all this was started, the doses for children were just scaled down adult doses. And so we have been going on a whole campaign, as you know, under BPCA and PREA to study children and with drugs. Here, it's going back and looking at these medicines, particularly, say, the cough and cold and some of the other medicines, and saying, really, is this appropriate for children, and what do we need to do about this?
Can you provide any examples of safety improvements that have been made to existing monographs and how long those changes have taken to be implemented? I know we touched on that earlier, but can you illuminate on that?
Let me consult my colleagues.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, most recently, it took 7 years for us to get the liver warnings on acetaminophen. You know, acetaminophen is the #1 cause of drug-induced liver failure in the United States. when we strengthened the warnings on acetaminophen, we were able to rapidly do the NDA acetaminophen and change those warnings very fast. In contrast, it took us 7 years, and of course, for the Monograph, and of course, a lot of the acetaminophen use is Monograph use.
And finally, how do you envision the special mechanism for rapidly responding to urgent safety issues? How do you envision that working?
We envision that we could have an interim final order that could be issued very rapidly, all right? And that order would be in place, and therefore manufacturers would have to conform to it. So they would have whatever labeling statement they had to put on. But subsequent to issuing that interim final order, there would be an administrative process so people could comment and there could be discussions and it could be modified. However, we could put the interim final order in place very rapidly, thus keeping people safe while we were discussing the issue.
Thank you. Dr. Woodcock, there was a suggestion earlier that perhaps the FDA has not been proactive enough to seek legislation to remedy some of these issues. It appears that you are the director for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research of FDA.
That's correct.
Are you permitted under your rules to pick up the telephone and call the chairman of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and ask for legislation?
No.
That would be unacceptable in your agency or any other agency in the federal government.
We're not allowed to lobby Congress. That's my understanding.
That's what I've learned in my 13 years. Thank you. Thank you so very much. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes a gentleman from Virginia. Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. All right, so it seems that we have a problem. Everybody agrees that we need to change things. We have a discussion draft in front of us. I've looked through it, but I would ask you, as our expert who always gives us good counsel. We don't always take it, but we always like to hear your opinion. Are there things in the bill that concern you? Things that we ought to take a look at changing the language on? And I know some of it's not finalized yet, but as the bill currently exists, is there anything in there that causes you concern?
No, not serious concern. I think we would like to continue to give technical assistance on it because, you know, the devil's in the details.
Always.
But we believe the broad outlines of this are where we need to be.
And likewise, is there anything that you would like to see in the discussion draft that's not currently in there?
I don't have a role in this, as I've told this committee before, but I recognize that there are many folks who want to talk about exclusivity. I don't believe that FDA has a role in those trade-offs, those societal trade-offs, but I believe that's something that needs to be resolved.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And not asking your opinion per se, but have you anticipated or have you felt any or heard any comments about the user fee portions of this bill? Are there groups out there that have told you they really oppose this and that this would be an impediment to bringing certain over-the-counter medicines, particularly in rural areas?
I have not heard that, all right? I recognize that some of the contract manufacturers, because the proposed fee right now is a facility fee, which is the most straightforward and simplest way to do this. If you're producing an OTC drug under the Monograph, you know, you'd be, the issues have been raised about the contract manufacturers and their obligation to pay a fee. Okay. And I think that is one of the more controversial areas. We feel that there's tremendous merit in maintaining a simple, uniform fee. A large number of the OTC manufacturers are small business, and so there's lots of small businesses involved here.
Right, and I wouldn't want to price them out, but at the same time, the other UFAs have been highly successful. Isn't that fairly much accepted?
Yes, and I believe they have been beneficial to industry as well, or they wouldn't have been reauthorized as they have been.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony here today, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Schrader is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Appreciate having here Ms. Woodcock. Thank you very much. So how many of these steps are we anticipating removing as a result of the new process? What would you expect?
I would say practically all. Right?
That's
We
welcome.
We want to put this behind us, basically. So part of this proposed legislation would put all the Monograph stuff behind us, transfer all these into a new status, kind of start not over, but start afresh, and have a timelines and plans for moving forward.
So would you be able to establish timelines? Is there a rough timeline template to Mr. Barton's earlier question that you would give us, and maybe some benchmark performance measures between you start, you get down the road a little bit, and then hopefully ultimately get to a decision?
Yeah, well, there are goals, and they phase in, because as I said, we're talking about managed growth. And in the first 2 years of this program, the plan would be to build a new system. We also have to deal with those legislatively and court-mandated projects, the Sunscreen Innovation Act, and some court-mandated things that we have to finish, all right? But we'd have to hire people, we'd need to create new standards and processes, we'd need to create a new IT system. We don't have any IT system for this.
But once that's all in play, I appreciate that.
Yes.
And there's probably a timeline you can give us for all that to occur.
Right.
That would help us judge the progress and help you with resources and whatever. But once that's all established, it'd be interesting to know what is the I heard a 2-year rough out from start to finish, and be interesting and helpful, I think, for the committee and for you to see if we're hitting those timelines. I'm sure it's a new program. We're going to have to make adjustments as we go forward here.
Right. Well, we had proposed or planned to have goals, okay, for everything. And so there would be a goal for when we do this and when we get that done, just like we do for the other user fee programs. So there would be a structured set of goals and timelines and percentage, like here's the timeline, and our goal would be to do 70% in this time frame. This year, and the next year it goes up to 80% and so on. It's pretty complicated. I can't go through it in 5 minutes. But for the existing monographs, what we'd plan to do is put forth a dashboard that would be in advance. And that would, because the industry is going to have to submit for the existing, what are now existing monographs. They're going to have to resubmit something, and then we'd have a timeline of when we expected that to come in, and then there would be an orderly process with timelines for accomplishing.
And can you share that with us?
Absolutely.
And I assume the industry understands they have to resubmit, and in general, they're okay with that, given the new process?
That is the plan, because right now we have this giant sort of mulch of documents that have been sent in over the years, and if we want to use the current scientific information to make a judgment.
Sure. And the last question, how much, you're about 30 FTE or something like that in this program. With the new revenue coming in, what's your initial expectation to gear up to, and where do you hope to be as a more level employee workforce?
Right. Ultimately, we would hire 105 new employees.
Wow, great.
So we would have then 135 doing this scientific work.
Very good. Thank you very much. Good luck. And I yield back, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes.
Thank me. And
Oh, there you are. How could I miss you?
Buddy came in to block me, so I couldn't see the witness.
All
I had to
right.
move up here.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, the over-the-counter monograph program is the key regulatory framework at the FDA for oversight of OTC medicines, which account for the bulk of medication consumed by Americans. I understand that the user fee program you're setting up is still relatively small, particularly when compared to some of the much larger programs that we've approved earlier this year. Could you discuss the user fee, why the user fees are needed?
Certainly, user fees are needed because we simply do not have enough staff to finalize all these and then deal with innovation coming forward. We have 30 staff to deal with more than 100,000 products that are on the market and currently this burdensome rulemaking process. Even if we were to move to an order process that was streamlined and very efficient, effective, the 30 staff could not make substantive progress against that in the next 5 years.
How are the user fees structured, and how are these fees collected?
The fees are going to be for any facility that manufactures a Monograph drug would have a flat fee. How much it would be depends on how many register. We're going to use our drug registration and listing system, which is an existing system, to capture all the facilities. It might be between like $14,000 and or a little less or a little more, depending on how many facilities participate per annum.
Okay, well, you mentioned in your testimony that the OTC Monograph process is one of the largest and most complex regulatory programs ever undertaken by the FDA. Could you discuss how OTC Monograph reform can address these regulatory challenges?
Certainly, by simplifying the process that we have to go through to finalize to finish in this case would be an order with the new process, is tremendously simpler than what we have to do with the Monograph. And orders can be amended over time through a simple process, so we can keep up with the science. And hopefully with the user fees, we'll have enough people to do that. But I have to be clear, this user fee program is not large enough to get all this done in the first 5 years. We will get the program set up and we will begin to work against it, and we will be accepting innovation, and that will all be good, and we'll be dealing promptly with safety issues, but we won't be finished with every single one of these because they do take a fair amount of scientific work. But we would never be finished with them. We will never finish this process if we do not modernize it.
Speaking of process, can you discuss the FDA's engagement with stakeholders during the process?
Certainly. As I said, I think in 2014, we had a public meeting about this, and to Representative Barton's point, we did own up to the fact that the process was broken, although some people came and told us it was simply because we were lazy or whatever. But we did ask the public, including advocates, consumer groups, and others, how, and the industry, how we could change and modernize this process, and we pointed out the different problems. Since that time, as we've been talking to industry about how we might change the process, we've also talked to public stakeholders, advocacy groups, consumer groups, professional groups, and so forth to keep people in the loop. Although I will admit, this is a rather obscure program, and many people were unaware of how this program operated and the problems that it had. We've had several public webinars, and we've also talked extensively to special stakeholders who have a particular stake in this, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Excuse me. How will the FDA address emerging challenges to ensure that the OTC Monograph program remains effective?
Well, I think one of the things we need to build in, which we've built into every single other user fee program that we have, are assessments. As I said earlier, we're going to have goals and objectives, and so we will have put forth what we expect our timeliness to be, how much we expect to get done, and then we will assess against that. And if we're failing on those measures, we will own up to it.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to commend the authors of the legislation for addressing something that evidently has been overlooked for decades. I want to start with a question about what you can and cannot do. I know that you cannot come to Congress and lobby for money. I know that you can't come to Congress and have something printed out and say, this bill needs to be introduced. But I've never heard in 25 years that anyone from any agency can't meet with members to discuss a shortcoming within the agency policy-wise, or anything surrounding what I just mentioned. So would you clarify this? Because I think it changes, for me, the complexion of this entire issue. Not that it doesn't need to be addressed, but it's just stunning to me that it hasn't been. So would you clarify, please?
Well, different administrations have different priorities. Administrations basically decide how the interactions with Congress are.
Well, you need to be more specific about that, though. I really want to understand this because it's important. Where is the agency precluded from essentially putting a spotlight on something that obviously has an effect on the population in the country, to say there's a shortcoming here and we need to work together to address this? I don't think that that's I don't think that that is something that changes with administrations. I think that's just part of the ongoing work of the agency and the Congress.
We certainly can, as we did, hold public meetings. We can write white papers. We can do many things depending on the priority.
But you're talking about internal to the agency and what you do there.
Right.
I'm talking about the relationship between the agency and Congress. Let me ask this. Is there any statute or rule that's written that prohibits the FDA from meeting with any members or chairs of committees or subcommittees to point out that there's a shortcoming somewhere, it's troubling to the agency, and that we need to work together on whatever the issue might be?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean,
Well-
we wish to put forth a legislative proposal that's put forward through the A19 process by the administration, right?
Well, clearly, this has really been overlooked, and my sense is that it rests more with the FDA than the Congress, but I'm glad that this is being taken up. Now, on the user fees, does 100% of the user fees that would be coming in fully fund the 130 positions that you have goals for?
We currently have funding, we currently fund 30 positions.
I know that, but
And the
you're
additional-
anticipating 130.
Yeah,
So will the user fees?
135, yeah, the 105 additional would be funded by user fees
By user,
fully.
fully. On the risks relative to the incomplete monographs, the risks that they pose, does that affect the pediatric population?
Yes.
It does. And can you give us an example?
Well, in pediatric cough and cold, in the early 2000s, we recognized that there was harm, significant harm to children, due to use of pediatric cough and cold medicines, right? But the Monograph statements were that they were safe and effective. So it's difficult.
Were they ever corrected?
Well, we have not fully, not yet. What we have done is worked with the industry.
I did BPCA, PREA, but in this area,
It doesn't apply.
It doesn't apply.
So what we did, we worked with the industry. They voluntarily changed their labeling, but as I showed for the acetaminophen example, not every manufacturer voluntarily changes their label. So, and we don't have tools right now because the regulation that's on the books or the tentative final regulation says safe and effective.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Chair thanks, gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Woodcock. Before I ask questions, I do want to indicate that it's my hope that the committee will examine the cosmetics issue. This has been discussed in opening statements by others. I'm involved in that issue with Mr. Pallone, the ranking member of the full committee. Millions of Americans use these products, and I have been working in a bipartisan capacity to advance consumer safety and provide a regulatory framework that furthers growth and innovation for American cosmetics manufacturers and small businesses. Consumers need to know that the products they are using are safe, and businesses need a 21st century FDA that responds as quickly as new great ideas are being developed. The statutory scheme governing cosmetics has been unchanged virtually for 70 years. This is an area where the committee should break ground and find a bipartisan solution for consumers and stakeholders. Mr. Chairman, on the issue we're discussing this morning, I have a letter that I would like to submit into the record from Colin McKenzie, who is the head for all of the Americas from GlaxoSmithKline Consumer Healthcare, and I respectfully request that that be put in the record. Thank you very much. Dr. Woodcock, off topic, but an issue of acute interest on the Hill right now, right to try legislation. I've been involved in this, and I'm interested in hearing your perspective on the proposal that recently passed in the Senate.
Well, first of all, my personal opinion, which I have testified on before, is that the federal government should not stand between someone who's dying and wants to try a medication. However, I feel if I were that person or a relative of that person, I would want to know if the last several people who'd taken that medication had survived or had died quickly or whatever. So I think for protecting people, it's important that there be some transparency about the outcomes of these uses if something were to pass. Now, the FDA, as you know, approves about 99% or 99.9% of all requests for uses of drugs. However, we're aware that certainly not all firms are willing to give out medicines because they may have a short supply, or they may be concerned about the situation or even the safety of the treatment for that particular individual. So it is, I believe, it's a complicated scenario, but I believe foremost we should consider not only the rights of patients, but their safety.
Thank you. The OTC Monograph reform bill we are considering provides for significant expansion of FDA's OTC drug review and oversight capacity. How will the boost in personnel, which we all favor, enable the FDA to resolve the OTC drug review backlog and timely consideration of applications for new innovative products?
Well, what we have envisioned and is envisioned in what has been written down so far is sort of a staged improvement where first infrastructure and hiring and training and so forth take place. Then innovation begins to be taken up, as well as early cases of finalizing these pending proceedings, and those will go over time with time frames. So what we envision is that we would start with the innovation along with dealing with the, quote, so-called backlog. And the safety, of course, immediately upon having this new program, we would be able to deal with safety problems much quicker, and we would.
Well, thank you, and I wish you well in that, and certainly we want to be involved to the greatest extent possible. Mr. Chairman, I yield back 32 seconds.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want to thank you for going through regular order with this bill, because I think that this is one of those issues that has really been a bugaboo for a long time. The agency has tried to deal with it. Congress has tried to deal with it. Dr. Woodcock, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is about the process that we've used to come up with the discussion draft on which we're having the hearing today. All of the group that everybody mentioned, the Republicans and Democrats on this committee who have been trying to work through this, we've been working with your agency for over a year on that. Is that correct?
Yes.
And maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the steps that the FDA took to get input for us on this OTC monograph reform bill from the various stakeholders.
Certainly. Well, as I said, we had a public meeting on this in 2014, and at that time pointed out the fact that the monographs were not getting finished and the difficulties we were having, the difficulties with safety, and also the problem with innovation. And there was a great deal of support for doing something. Subsequently with that, we met with the industry numerous times, a large number of times, trying to work out what such a program would look like so that Congress would have something to work with, right, and getting through a lot of the technical issues. So there were numerous meetings about both the policy changes, the legislative changes that would enable us to have orders and so forth, as well as what a user fee program might look like. At the same time, we posted meeting minutes of those meetings, and we had various public interactions at different times, and we met with some of the more involved stakeholders, some of whom will testify today as well.
So, and in addition, as the bill was being drafted, I assume that your staff gave technical assistance to the committee staff on this energy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
So really the draft we're looking at today is sort of an amalgam of all of those processes that we've had up until today. I want to ask you about a specific provision of the discussion draft that allows the FDA to include requirements for the packaging of a drug to help protect children from harm, such as thorough unit dosing packaging or through unit dosage packaging or other requirements. Does the packaging language include in the discussion draft give the FDA sufficient authority to require packaging information to protect children from risks, or is there more that needs to be done?
No, we believe this language is adequate.
And why do you believe that?
Because it says other appropriate requirements, so it gives us fairly wide scope.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of your efforts and your agency's efforts. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida. Mr. Bilirakis, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Dr. Woodcock, in your testimony, you mentioned that roughly 1/3 of the monographs started decades ago are still not being finished. Can you give us a sense of the size of this backlog? How big is it? How long do you think it will take to clear the backlog? What types of submissions are in the backlog?
Well, first of all, you have to understand this backlog is a little different than say, what you used to talk about, the generic backlog, which we have dealt with. These products are still on the market, right? All these products are on the market. And the process of finalizing the monograph would perhaps remove some of those from the market, right? And establish the conditions under which they can be marketed and perhaps limit those. So there are about 100 ingredients, I think, several hundred ingredients left out of 800 that haven't been finalized. And there are about many uses, more than several hundred uses of those ingredients, because many ingredients are used for multiple different uses. It's difficult to have a count because until we get to the final monograph, we don't know what'll be in or out in each one of those. But that's the ballpark. It's about 1/3.
About a third, and how long will you think it'll take to clear the backlog?
Well, it would definitely, we believe, take well beyond the 5-year period.
Okay. Your testimony shows that funding for FDA's Monograph products is fairly flat, somewhere roughly between 7 and 8 million annually. Have submissions been fairly flat year to year? Are they increasing?
Well, the activity has increased because of all the new scientific knowledge, and as I showed you this chart earlier, the churn that happens with any given monograph as we learn more scientific information. But this was fixed really in 1972, and so we don't have any new submissions at all to this in the sense of new ingredients added or whatever, except a few that might be foreign ingredients that could come within the time and extent pathway, which was what the Sunscreen Innovation Act dealt with.
Okay, next question. In your testimony, you talked about the slow timeline for changes to the Monograph. You used the example of liver injury for generic Tylenol taking 7 years to update the warning. My goodness. How would monography reform shorten the time frame substantially? What changes would be required by statute, and what can FDA do what can they do administratively?
Yes, the goal would be that we could have an interim final rule on safety, on specific kind of safety changes. And we could issue that rather quickly. And then it would be binding. And then the discussion about it and any further adjudication could occur after that, and we would go to a final rule after we'd get public comment. But say we find out a safety problem, a serious safety problem, can be dealt with labeling. We issue an interim final rule, all the labels change so people are protected, and then we can have further scientific discussions and go to a final rule that would, have had that chance for people to have a lot of discussion.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much. Dr. Woodcock, let me just say personally, first of all, how much I appreciate what you do and your testimony here. I think you're always transparent and candid and informed. And I thank you very, very much for that. And, we can all look back and think, well, maybe we should have moved ahead further or faster on this issue. But here we are today, and I know that you'll be working with us to make sure that we deal with over-the-counter drugs. I wanted to reaffirm something that's been said a number of times, and that is that I am hoping very much that the committee moves forward on cosmetics. Mm-hmm. I have a bill, the Cosmetic Safety Act, that I've been working on for a long time. But, when we have shampoos that cause people to lose their hair, a child who lost all her hair, or a teen's eyeshadow is tainted by asbestos, the FDA right now is unable to act. So never let it be said that we ignored the issue of cosmetics, and I think that's another thing we need to move forward on. But back to OTC. We've talked a lot about the administrative problems, about how long it takes to regulate, the cumbersomeness of the process. But I wonder if you could just succinctly list the safety issues that we need to address that aren't being addressed right now.
Okay, well, we could start with the skin reactions to acetaminophen. We could start with, we can add the safety problems with pediatric cough and cold medications. We can...
Is that in part what using the sweet gummy kinds of things that might attract children?
That's a safety issue related to, the dosage form and overdoses in children. That's another issue that we would be dealing with. there were quite a few. We finally finished the liver warning for acetaminophen, but there are other over-the-counter drugs that we probably need to move on safety.
So do you think that once this process is in place, that there will be over-the-counter drugs that will be removed? You alluded to that in the last set of questions.
Well, the Monograph system itself envisions removing, when we have a final monograph, certain ingredients out of the monograph. That's kind of how it works. They're all on the market to start with, and as we go through this process, they get removed. So as we finalize these monographs, certain ingredients will no longer be permissible to be marketed in the United States. Most of them don't have serious safety issues. Some of them simply don't have any data that show they work.
And so some would have to have more warnings.
They might have to have more warnings, or they simply might have to withdraw because they can't produce any data that show that they're effective.
So this new process would be a before-the-fact look at these drugs, or no? Would they still go on the market anyway, away?
No drugs, supposedly, since 1972 have gone on the market. This process now only deals with drugs that were on the market in 1972 or before. So what we're planning to put in place, if Congress, agrees with this, is a process where we could move new ingredients into this process and have them regulated this way, which is much less burdensome for the industry. For products that are OTC products where multiple parties can market them.
Let me ask you one more thing. As you know, the Consumer Product Safety Commission is charged with implementing and enforcing special packaging and child-resistant package requirements. I'm just wondering how you work, the FDA work and interact with the Consumer Product Safety Commission on these packaging requirements.
Certainly, we work very closely with them. We recognize their standards. They set the standard for child-resistant packaging, say for bottles, and how you test for that and so forth. And were this to move forward, we could have a memorandum of understanding with them on how we would notify them about anything we were doing on packaging to make sure that they were aware of if we were making some safety unit of use packaging or whatever, we'd let them know.
Thank you. I yield back. Appreciate you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also thank Dr. Woodcock for coming before this committee again and explaining to us why it's so necessary to take these long, what I'm learning are overdue steps to update our over-the-counter monograph process. I appreciate that you've talked about some of the challenges, and you just went through some of specific problems, but wondered if there were any other examples of how the inefficiencies in the existing OTC drug monograph system have exposed Americans to risk from potentially unsafe, which you just talked about, I believe, or possibly ineffective drug products. Are there any specific examples you'd like to provide?
Well, until we get the monographs finalized, it's hard to call them ineffective until they're approved, a current system, until they're shown by, a regulation is published saying they're ineffective. So that's one of our conundrums. It fits very well with your question. They aren't officially ineffective until they're found ineffective in a final regulation.
That's what's been so problematic, is getting to that point.
Yes, it's very difficult to get to that point, yes. And, people can always submit more data and all these types of things. We propose them as ineffective and then back and forth. So it can be prolonged very long.
Thank you. We know that American patients, providers, and manufacturers have benefited greatly from Congress's previous authorization of FDA user fees for prescription drugs, generic drugs, biologic and biosimilar drugs, animal drugs, medical devices. But we know that OTC drugs products have lagged behind. So how do you believe that the user fees authorized in this legislation, combined with congressional appropriations, will give you the necessary resources to bring the OTC drug regulation on par with other drug and medical products? And then secondly, in addition to the personnel increases, which you've talked about, going from 30 to 135, what resources will this legislation provide FDA to improve the system?
Well, we plan to spend about $26 million on investing in an IT system so that this becomes paperless instead of a paper-intensive process. And that would require about $3 million a year ongoing for maintenance once it's built. So the $26 million would be spread out over the first 4 years or so of the program. We would also invest in training of our people, developing processes and different matters like that. But this level of program, as I said, will not result in the monographs all being in the new order system, in having all final orders at the end of 5 years. It's not going to be that fast.
No, I appreciate that, and you've certainly let us know that and have set the expectations. Are you saying that right now the current system relies on a paper process?
To a great extent. Mm-hmm.
And so the building of an appropriate IT system, which doesn't exist right now, would be incredibly helpful.
Yes, and since we're going to put what I call the mulch behind all this past documentation that we have, it's all over the place, we can have an electronic gateway like we do for the other user fee programs, so submissions are electronic, there's standardized formats, many things that help everybody in a modern system be efficient.
And have, just out of curiosity, you talked about additional training that would be needed besides the 30 staff that are currently on board. Have they been involved in this system or in this process in a significant way?
Yes, yes. And embracing themselves if they have to train all these new people and try to complete some of the work at the same time.
Thank you. Thanks. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingle. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, like everybody here, we're a fan and really grateful for all the work you're doing and sitting here through all these questions, many of which sound the same. But I think we're all saying that we think the OTC system's broken. We don't think it's working for patients, for doctors, for people in the industry who are making innovative product. And your testimony said this, and the questions and answers we're getting keeps reaffirming that. But just for the record, again, it is true that there are far more OTC monograph products than branded prescription drug products.
That is true.
And despite this fact, FDA got only $7.9 million last year to review OTC products, while prescription drug spending totaled $1.1 billion when user fees were included. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I do have this question because when you're talking about the 5 years,
yes,
and you're talking about creating an IT system that doesn't exist, is it going to can money help accelerate that 5 years? Will getting you more money?
Well, we can always do more with more, and we can move faster with more. Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe at some point you could give us how much you need to create that IT system, which will accelerate it, and maybe give us a little, that's not in any of the planned questions, but I think it's a question that's really popping here. Will the draft legislation we're considering today give FDA the resources the agency needs to do a more effective job?
Definitely a more effective job, absolutely. Especially combined, we need the authorities to do a more effective job. We can't use these authorities.
So, as you just said, the lack of funding is not the only issue. The draft legislation we're considering today also gives FDA the authority to use administrative orders to make changes to OTC monographs rather than the current notice and comment rulemaking progress, which has left many monographs unfinalized and critical safety issues unaddressed. Does FDA believe that these changes in the draft legislation would make it easier to allow innovative products to make it to the market while also allowing the agency to address the safety issues faster?
Yes, there's a specific innovation pathway that's been built in with timelines and deliverables and so forth, and we definitely contemplate that there's innovation to be had in this space.
So thank you. I think this draft bill goes a long way, but I want to take a step back a bit and give some context. In 2014, Congress came together unanimously to pass the Sunscreen Innovation Act because our nation's facing a skin cancer epidemic, and the last time a new OTC sunscreen ingredient was approved was in the 1990s, which you know. This is a symptom of how broken the OT system is overall, But it's more pressing and it's more urgent because there are 5 million Americans being treated for skin cancer every year, and the rate of melanoma is on the rise. So while OTC reform is going to make it easier for all innovative products to safely and quickly get to market, we cannot forget the urgent need to ensure that Americans have access to sunscreen products that have been used safely for decades overseas. This is where the frustration comes from all of us. Dr. Woodcock, Congress remains concerned about this skin cancer epidemic. Can we work with you and other stakeholders to ensure Americans have access to the latest sunscreen ingredients? And what do we need to do to make sure that's here now?
Well, we have, met, as I said, all the stipulations, actually exceeded them in the Sunscreen Innovation Act. And what we're waiting for is safety data to be submitted. What the Sunscreen Innovation Act did not do is lower the standards for safety for OTC medicines. And so when we receive those data, we'll be able to review them promptly because, as I said, the Sunscreen Innovation Act is one of our highest priorities.
So how long is it going to take to get that data? What's the holdup? Why is this so complicated?
Under most of the things that FDA regulates, we don't do that research. The research is done by the sponsors because they have the medicines, the drugs, the formulations, and they submit that research to us. So we wait for them to conduct the research. We give them parameters about what the research should look like and to meet the standards, and then it's on their time frames.
Do we know their time frames?
We certainly are in contact with them about their activities. I personally have met with them fairly recently.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, thank you for being here. Help me to understand something here. And I've been in between subcommittee meetings, so please excuse me if I've missed this. When you come up with a profile for a certain ingredient, does it apply to every product, every manufacturer that has that product out there? For instance, ibuprofen. If you come up with a profile for ibuprofen, then you say, if you have ibuprofen in your product, you have to have this on your monograph.
The monograph specifies the ingredient, ibuprofen, if that were in there, which it isn't, but it specifies the ingredient, it specifies the dosages that can be used, and then and the regimen, and then it specifies what conditions it can be sort of advertised for, right? And if you then market using those parameters, then you don't have to send in an application.
If you market, so tell me, if you find out something, if you find out that ibuprofen over in a certain dosage causes hepatotoxicity or is eating your stomach up, and you want to warn again, so you go to every product out there that has a certain amount of ibuprofen in it, and you say you need to add this to your monograph.
No, the monograph is an FDA regulation.
Okay.
And so we would have to change if for an ingredient.
But if you change it, do they have to? Does every product out there have to change?
They would have to add the warning. That's correct.
They would have to add the warning. So that seems simple enough.
It only if you got this slide. We have to, first of all, we have to have a final monograph in place, okay? And then we have to change it through rulemaking, through notice and comment.
How long does that process take?
6-8 years.
Oh, please.
Here's one. This is the external analgesic.
I've seen that. I'm just, why does it take that long?
Because
it doesn't take that long with prescription medications. They get them off the market quicker than that.
Oh yeah, we get them off the market lickety-split if they're dangerous,
Absolutely.
Right? Here the issue is, especially say we have a final monograph in place, the government has a regulation. The regulation states this drug is generally recognized as safe and effective. And now we're saying, oh, it's not safe, okay, but we have a regulation that says it's safe. So for the lawyers in the room, they understand the problem, okay. We have to then, what we do now, because of that, we issue safety alerts and we look for voluntary changes to the labels, but we can't mandate changes until
Why not?
because it's a regulation.
It's a regulation legislatively?
No,
Or
it's a
through your
regulate-
rules that you promulgated?
Rules that we promulgate, and we have to promulgate a new rule. That's how the rules work before it gets changed.
All right, let me ask you something. What about off-label uses? You know that happens. I mean, I practiced pharmacy for over 30 years, and I did that regularly. Do you ever address that?
Well, we address it in the sense that if an off-label use is leading to harm, we will send out safety alerts and tell people and so forth.
So if a product has been on the market for years, let's just take, for example, diphenhydramine. For many years, that was just an antihistamine that you use for bee stings or something like that. Then I always recommended it to help somebody sleep, and now you've got Benadryl PM, and you've got products, and they're marketing for that now. So how long does that take to get that new indication there?
Well, they're already part of they're already part of the sleep aids monograph.
They are now, but
They are now.
initially they weren't.
They always were, right?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But nevertheless,
Okay, to get a new one is what you're asking about.
exactly.
There's no
Or
way to do that.
antihistamine. And antihistamine is indicated now for sinus drainage. I mean, at one time when I was in school, which was just a few years ago, but at one time when I was in school, it was, it was a side effect.
Right.
But that's what we used it for. So if a new indication comes out, how long does it take you to get that new indication for them
Okay.
to be able to market it that way?
Under the monograph, there is no way to do that. Unless it was marketed for that purpose before 1972, then it isn't eligible for the monograph. They could file an NDA.
Before 1972?
This whole system is fixed in 1972 and in the past.
I think we have discovered the problem. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock.
Most welcome.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Dr. Woodcock, I deferred my questions to the end, and I just have a couple. First off, you mentioned at the start that you had 88 pending monographs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does the committee have that list, or are you able to share that with the
We
committee?
certainly could provide that to
And
you.
I think it would just provide some context of what we're working on. And with Mr. Carter's line of questions, there used to be an over-the-counter asthma inhaler, and there is not.
Yeah.
Now, that was prior to 1972
Right.
that product was available.
Right.
So let me just ask the question, because I know I'm going to get it from other people. Where do we stand with providing that active pharmaceutical ingredient that was in an over-the-counter asthma inhaler prior to 1972?
Right. I can't comment on, pending applications, so forth. That was not a monograph product. That was a new drug application product.
A new drug application?
Product, yeah. So there are products over the counter, like say Cordaid or whatever, your vaginal antifungals. Those were all switched from prescription drugs, and they still have a new drug application. They are not monograph products.
I see. Well, let me just make the plea that asthmatics do need an over-the-counter preparation. They shouldn't have to incur an emergency room charge in the middle of the night just to get a little bit of relief.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield?
Briefly.
I'm sorry. What do you do in situations like pseudoephedrine that has been approved but is being abused? And do you do anything in that situation?
Well, Congress took the step of moving that, restricting its.
Why would Congress need to? Why wouldn't you? I would thought that was your job.
I don't think we have the authority to do that.
So if you see that a drug that has been approved in the 1972 Act is now being abused, you don't have the authority to do something about it?
We can move against things on safety grounds, that's right, but it was actually being used as an ingredient, that one, in manufacturing an abused drug, methamphetamine.
Is that not enough?
I would not like to give a legal opinion here and.
And if the gentleman, reclaiming my time, I think there have been various state regulations that have been applied and that is why in different states there's a different requirement as to whether or not you need to show a driver's license to purchase those products. However, when there was a product that was marketed as a weight loss product that contained ephedrine or some derivative of ephedrine, I think you all did move pretty quickly to remove that from the market.
We did, and that was there were safety events related to that.
Well, I want to thank you for being here today, and just to address the comments that were made, actually on both sides of the dais, you know, where's the committee been, where's the agency been? I mean, I've just been through my third reauthorization of the user fee agreements. This concept was brought to me late in the spring. We were pretty far down the road on the user fee agreements, and I made the decision nothing was going to deter us from getting the user fee agreements across the finish line, and we did, recognizing that there would be some serious personnel repercussions at the agency if we did not do our work, but we did. I also committed that we would tackle this problem quickly after we got the user fee agreements put together and delivered, and so here we are today. I know I personally have made 3 trips to the Food and Drug Administration, your physical campus, and you received myself and staff one time when we were worried about the drug shortages a few years ago. I would think I was there on Dr. Hamburg's first day. Dr. von Essenbach was kind enough to have me out in the previous iteration of your headquarters. So the agency, I have always found, has been very welcoming to committee members, and there has never been that I have detected any reluctance of the agency to talk to members of the committee. Now, maybe there are rules that prohibit the direct communication as far as what would be considered as lobbying, but generally the flow of information from the agency to at least myself as a member of Congress, I've always found that door to be open, and I've been grateful for that. I'm grateful for your testimony here today. I think you've helped this process, and clearly it's something that needs to be addressed and needs to be fixed, and we will continue to pursue it and get it done. We'll conclude this panel. I'm not going to recess in the interest of time. We do have another panel to follow, but again, thank you, Dr. Woodcock, and we'll look forward to your next adventure here.
Adventure?
We'll now hear from our second panel of witnesses. And again, we do want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by questions from members. Our second panel will hear from Mr. Scott Melville, the President and CEO of Consumer Products Association, Ms. Kirsten Moore, Project Director, Pew Charitable Trust Healthcare Products, Mr. Michael Werner, Partner, Holland & Knight, on behalf of Public Access to Sunscreens Coalition, Dr. Bridget Jones, Chair, Committee on Drugs, American Academy of Pediatrics, and Mr. Gil Roth, President, Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. We do appreciate you being here today. Mr. Melville, you're recognized 5 minutes for an opening statement, please. Sir, let me just ask you, your microphone.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today on the over-the-counter monograph system and the importance of modernizing regulation to enhance the public health. My name is Scott Melville, and I am President and CEO of the Consumer Healthcare Products Association. Since 1881, CHPA has served as the industry association representing leading manufacturers and marketers of over-the-counter medicines in the United States. CHPA member companies produce the vast majority of OTC medicines in our country and provide millions of Americans with safe, effective, and affordable therapies to treat and prevent many common ailments and conditions. The availability of self-care treatment options saves money, reduces burdens on the healthcare system, and keeps consumers active and productive. Given the importance of OTC medicines to consumers and our nation's healthcare system, it's essential that the regulatory structure that oversees these medicines is one that is modern, efficient, transparent, and accommodating to innovation. Now, the vast majority of OTC medicines in our homes today are regulated under the OTC monograph system, and our members strongly support the system. It oversees over 300 active ingredients and more than 100,000 non-prescription products, ranging from antacids to diaper rash creams, from pain relievers to cough and cold products. While the OTC system was created over 40 years ago, as we've heard earlier today from several speakers, the process is still not complete. Movement on unfinished items has ground to a halt, largely because the system is based on notice and comment rulemaking, a thorough but extremely time-consuming process that has slowed across all government agencies and departments in recent years. Change is needed to have a regulatory system that accounts for advances in science, accommodates innovation, permits timely updates to safety information, and creates a workable process for completing unfinished monographs. CHPA has therefore worked with FDA and members of the Congress to provide recommendations for a modernized monograph process by which FDA could make scientific determinations for these ingredients through an administrative order process rather than notice and comment rulemaking, with necessary due process protections for dispute resolution and issue escalation. These improvements would empower the FDA to act more quickly when needed to address safety issues or other monograph changes, while preserving the existing monograph structure, a structure that does not require unnecessary pre-market review, provided manufacturers utilize ingredients that have been determined to be generally recognized as safe and effective by the FDA. We understand that this new system, if enacted by Congress, will require more effort on FDA's part, which is why our industry is willing to supplement government resources with a modest user fee program. We believe the fee agreement strikes the right balance and will help achieve a more nimble regulatory structure for monograph drugs that would be a win-win-win for consumers, manufacturers, and regulators. In summary, the draft legislation we are discussing today is incredibly important and, if enacted, will impact the health of nearly every American for decades to come. It's the product of months and even years of consideration and compromise between many stakeholders, including CHPA's manufacturer members. CHPA has some important technical comments on the discussion draft, and we look forward to continuing to work with members of this committee to finalize the text and support its introduction and consideration by the Congress in the very near future. Thank you. I look forward to addressing any questions you might have.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Ms. Morey, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding the hearing and for the invitation to testify. My name is Kirsten Moore, and I direct the Pew Charitable Trust's Healthcare Products Project. Pew is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and advocacy center, and I am here today in strong support of this legislation that would help update FDA's regulation of over-the-counter products. By streamlining FDA's process, you have the opportunity to improve consumer safety and promote innovation. My remarks will focus on the problems with the outdated OTC monograph system, its public health implications, and the benefits of the proposed legislation. Each year, more than 240 million Americans use OTC products. This marketplace is vast and diverse, with up to 300,000 products. ranging from cough and cold to sunscreen to pain relievers. And in theory, the active ingredients in these products are considered safe and effective when consumers follow the instructions on the label without direction from a healthcare provider. In practice, however, many contain ingredients that the FDA has not yet evaluated. There's no deadline by which FDA's ingredients reviews must be finalized, and several of these reviews have lasted decades. Two main problems lead us to this point. First, FDA is hampered by a cumbersome and inefficient regulatory system in evaluating these products. It's a system that has not been updated since its introduction in 1972. Second, FDA has only 30 full-time employees and approximately $8.2 million to oversee this growing marketplace. FDA evaluates safety and efficacy of OTC ingredients through a monograph system, which is described in greater detail in my written testimony. But important to note that changing a monograph is a multi-step process involving review by FDA, the Department of Health and Human Services, and often the White House Office of Management and Budget. In contrast, FDA review of prescription drugs relies solely within FDA's jurisdiction. The additional steps for review for OTC products add considerable time and do not add to the key determinations of safety and efficacy. Let me provide just one example of the current system's effects on public health. This April, FDA required that companies add the strongest form of warning label to children's prescription cough and pain medications containing codeine. The drug can cause potentially fatal breathing problems, especially in children under 12. These safety concerns led an advisory committee to recommend that FDA remove codeine from OTC products in 2015, but FDA has not made this change yet because of the inefficient monograph system. When patients are in harm's way, we need action, not bureaucracy. This spring, Pew and several other public health stakeholders issued a set of principles for over-the-counter monograph reform. These principles are broadly reflected in both the House and Senate language, and the bipartisan legislation that you are considering would produce a win-win. I'll up it to win-win-win, reducing regulatory burdens and protecting consumers in 4 key ways. First, by driving efficiency. The proposed reforms will replace cumbersome rulemaking with an administrative order process, again aligning FDA's decision-making authority for OTC products with its authority for prescription drugs. The legislation also would expedite the review process by giving the Secretary additional authority for data collection. Second, improving safety. The proposal will ensure that if FDA has reason to believe a product is unsafe, it can take swift action. Currently, products remain on the market when FDA has insufficient information about whether or not they are safe and effective because they cannot be removed before a final monograph is issued. Third, helping innovation. Under this legislation, FDA could more quickly accommodate innovation in OTC drug products, permitting new ingredients as well as new indications and formulations on existing ingredients. And lastly, providing resources. The proposed agreement would provide FDA with the resources required to clear up FDA's review backlog, address safety concerns for products currently on the market, and review future applications for innovative products in a more timely manner. Pew supports the proposed legislation because it will lead to improvements in consumer safety and administrative efficiency. It strikes a sensible balance and reflects thoughtful compromise between stakeholders. The current monograph system has had detrimental effects on consumers and hinders FDA's ability to ensure the safety and effectiveness of over-the-counter products. We applaud this subcommittee for this bipartisan proposal and urge Congress to capitalize on this momentum and pass this legislation as soon as possible. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Mr. Werner, you're recognized for 5 minutes for opening statement, please.
The PASS Coalition. Thank you for inviting me to testify today regarding efforts to improve and strengthen the approval process for over-the-counter OTC products, including sunscreen ingredients. The PASS Coalition is a multi-stakeholder coalition composed of public health groups, dermatologists, sunscreen manufacturers, and leading advocates for skin cancer patients. The PASS Coalition was formed to ensure Americans have access to the latest sunscreen technology to curb the skin cancer epidemic in the United States. And to address this problem, Congress, led by this subcommittee, the FDA, the coalition, and other stakeholders came together to enact the bipartisan Sunscreen Innovation Act, the SIA, in 2014 to ensure Americans get access to new sunscreens. And working together, We identified regulatory barriers to the consideration of OTC sunscreen ingredients and created historic reforms to address them. And the act was enacted by the House and Senate unanimously. The PASS Coalition supports the efforts of this subcommittee to extend similar reforms to other OTC product categories. We also support the establishment of a user fee program to provide FDA with the resources it needs to implement these reforms. Based on our experience over the last 3 years with implementation of the SIA and our productive conversations with FDA leadership, including Dr. Woodcock, we believe there are several improvements needed to continue to enhance the review process for pending and new sunscreen ingredients. And the OTC reform legislation being considered by this subcommittee provides the opportunity to codify these improvements and achieve the promise of the SIA. Now, Mr. Chairman, skin cancer remains a public health crisis in the United States. According to the Surgeon General, over 5 million Americans are treated for skin cancer every year. And each year there are more new cases of skin cancer than breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, and colon cancer combined. And in the U.S., a patient is diagnosed with melanoma every 8 minutes, and an American loses her life every hour from the disease. So clearly, Americans need access to all available safe and effective sunscreen products. The last time a new OTC sunscreen ingredient was approved in the U.S. was decades ago. And since 2002, 8 new sunscreen ingredients have been submitted for review under the FDA's so-called time and extent process. And these ingredients have been widely available in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere for decades. Clearing this backlog of applications will ensure that Americans have greater access to broad-spectrum sunscreens and get better protection against both UVA and UVB rays. As you've heard this morning, FDA has met all the timelines required by the Act. But unfortunately, none of the 8 pending sunscreen ingredients has yet received a final decision, and they are not available in the United States. Based on recent conversations with FDA, there is agreement that some changes to the SIA for the 8 pending ingredients are needed, and that any new OTC pathway should accommodate sunscreen ingredients. So as Congress considers OTC reform legislation, the PASS Coalition respectfully submits the following principles for consideration. First, the 8 sunscreen ingredients that have already received proposed administrative orders should continue to be considered under the SIA. New sunscreen ingredients should go through the OTC reform framework. Second, any new OTC drug approval pathway should be flexible enough to accommodate new sunscreen ingredients with U.S. or international market experience and should not require the sponsor to file a new drug application for its active ingredient to be considered for an OTC administrative order. Third, any OTC reform legislation should authorize FDA to meet individually on a confidential basis with sponsors of sunscreen ingredients to allow for open discussion of commercial confidential information and trade secrets. And finally, the FDA's testing standards for these products should be periodically reviewed and assessed. Inclusion of provisions that incorporate these principles will ensure Americans have access to safe and effective sunscreen ingredients that are available across the world. The draft legislation that we've seen contain many of these provisions, and we look forward to continuing to working with the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair recognizes Dr. Jones. 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Burgess and Ranking Member Green. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today about the importance of modernizing the regulation of over-the-counter drugs for America's children. My name is Dr. Bridget Jones. I'm a practicing allergy, asthma immunologist and pediatric clinical pharmacologist at Children's Mercy in Kansas City, Missouri. I also conduct clinical research to improve the safety and efficacy of drugs for children. I'm here today to represent the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the AAP. In my practice, I frequently need to discuss with parents the risks and benefits of using OTC medicines to treat common pediatric ailments, such as allergies and asthma. As a pediatrician advising parents, I want to know that the products I recommend have been tested in children to ensure that they are safe, effective, and labeled appropriately for their use. Therefore, we must have a process to regulate them that is responsive to the most recent medical science. The current OTC regulation process at the FDA is not nimble to adapt to emerging evidence, safety concerns, or product innovation. Burdensome regulatory processes cause unnecessary delays. The OTC monograph was in large part developed based on evidence from 50 years ago. Some of these drugs continue to be mainstays of pediatric practice, but others we know from more recent evidence provide little or no benefit to children. Put simply, the current system does not serve the needs of children. The only way to ensure reliable and safe OTC medicines for families is to change how the monograph system works and provide significant new resources for the endeavor. Therefore, the AAP strongly supports the efforts of Congress to reform the process and create a user fee program to fund FDA's monograph work. The monograph regulating cough and cold medicines for children is a good example of how the process does not work. The data that led FDA to label these medicines for children does not meet today's standards, and data gathered since then clearly shows certain cough and cold products to be completely ineffective for children. Nevertheless, these products are still commonly marketed to children despite safety risks. While FDA agreed to revise the monograph more than a decade ago, today FDA has yet to publish even draft changes, despite evidence that these products result in thousands of pediatric overdose-related emergency department visits each year. It is our hope that through a reformed OTC monograph system, the FDA will act at long last to modernize the cough and cold monograph. We also must ensure that innovation made possible by OTC reform does not have unintended negative consequences. One area where we anticipate greater industry innovation is in the development of novel formulations for OTC products. It's possible that industry may work on developing gummy formulations of drugs, much like supplement manufacturers have done in recent years with their marketing of gummy vitamins. Gummy formulations of OTC drugs, whether intended for children or for adults, would greatly concern pediatricians because we know that when a product looks and tastes like candy, children will eat it. If a child consumed gummy acetaminophen, for instance, outside the watchful eye of parents, it could lead to a trip to the emergency room or worse. Therefore, FDA must have clear authority to regulate the packaging of OTC drugs, including requirements for unit dose packaging, such as blister packs, to prevent abuse or misuse and protect against unsupervised ingestion. While the Consumer Product Safety Commission has existing authority to require that certain drugs come in child-resistant packaging, tested to ensure that it's difficult for children to open, CPSC cannot require specific types of packaging. Therefore, FDA must be able to do so, and since CPSC only requires a small handful of OTC monograph drugs to be sold in child-resistant packaging, greater collaboration between FDA and CPSC is critically important. Mr. Chairman, the latest discussion draft is largely reflective of the AAP's principles for OTC monograph reform. We strongly support the packaging language. Additionally, we look forward to continuing to work with the committee to ensure that the FDA and CPSC establish processes for notification when the FDA takes action that might warrant CPSC reevaluation of its own packaging regulations. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today about this important issue.
Chair, thanks, Dr. Jones. Mr. Roth, you're recognized 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony today about the proposed over-the-counter Monograph Safety, Innovation, and Reform Act of 2017. I'm Gil Roth, President of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, or PBOA. The PBOA is a leading trade association for contract manufacturing organizations and contract development and manufacturing organizations, known as CMOs and CDMOs, in the pharma and biopharma space. PBOA's core mission is to advance the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests of the CMO and CDMO sector. I'm here today to express PBOA's support for the newly released OMUFA draft, to urge this committee and the Congress to advance this draft, and to express my thanks for ensuring that this draft takes into account the unique needs of the CMO-CDMO community. Your willingness to ensure our seat at the table is greatly appreciated, and PBOA strongly believes resulted in the release of a better OMUFA draft deserving of bipartisan support. Now, you may be wondering what a CMO and CDMO actually is and how these companies contribute to the development of drugs, or in this case, over-the-counter drugs. CMOs, CDMOs are the true experts in manufacturing. Our members, who are predominantly domestic, provide manufacturing, formulation technology, packaging, and other services that enable drug companies to develop and commercialize medicines. They help make more than 1/3 of all doses dispensed to patients in America, producing both innovator drugs and generics, small molecules and biologics, pills to injectables, OTCs, and biosimilars. CMOs, CDMOs empower their customers to bring life-saving, cost-effective, quality medicines to patients. I've been involved in the CMO sector since 1999 and have witnessed the industry's rapid growth and the key role it plays in the American healthcare system. I'd like to commend the committee for your continued focus on the important issues we'll examine today. The FDA has long outstanding commitments to produce and finalize over-the-counter monographs, work that began the year after I was born. And as has been noted, in the current fiscal year, the FDA has allocated $8 million to such efforts, some that can yield only minimal dedicated staffing and little progress. Industry, the FDA, and the Congress can agree that the monograph process overall is outdated, and further, that there's recognition that monograph review cannot expand without additional resources. The legislation under consideration should help solve those issues. It'll provide resources to FDA to finalize long unfinished monographs, giving manufacturers a degree of certainty. As with other user fee programs, the transparency and goals dictated by the commitment letter should provide industry with increased predictability. OMUFA's path for innovation to establish ingredients is overdue and could benefit manufacturers and marketers alike, including CMOs that specialize in unique dosage forms. Although PBOA was not included in the negotiations between industry and FDA, we're pleased that the legislative text under discussion today includes a fee model that reflects a differential value of OTC monograph products to CMOs and CDMOs, and that it provides them a degree of relief from the facility fees proposed to fund OMUFA overall. And again, we're very appreciative of this committee's role in ensuring that all stakeholder voices were heard as you develop this OMUFA draft. We hope that PBOA and the CDMO, CMO businesses that it represents will be included in future FDA user fee negotiations, particularly ones that are considering contributions from the manufacturing sector in the form of facility fees. And we look forward to continuing to participate in the legislative process relating to OMUFA and to the day when this good legislation is signed into law. Thank you again for the opportunity, and we're available for questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. We'll move into the member question portion of the hearing, and I am going to yield to Mr. Guthrie of Kentucky. 5 minutes for your questions, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Melville. The issue of new sunscreen approvals are important to me and are a key component of this package. I have worked on the Sunscreen Innovation Act in the past and have worked to ensure in this package that we work to further addressing the continued holdup we see of these products at the FDA. Mr. Melville, can you outline for us today the positive benefits that you see in monograph proposal for sunscreen products?
Yes, as has been mentioned earlier, sunscreens are considered drugs because of the health claims that are made on sunscreens in the United States. They're regulated as over-the-counter drugs. They are within the monograph today. They are in the monograph system, and over the years have gone through a very long and extensive process with many stops and starts. Yep. As science has evolved over the years, new ingredients have been available elsewhere in the United States, but there hasn't been a process, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned, to really innovate under the monograph system. With the exception of a process called time and extent applications. That has never proven to be a very effective approach to market, very time-consuming, and therefore the monograph reforms being discussed today would open up a new opportunity to bring new ingredients to the market through the monograph system, not using notice and comment rulemaking as has been traditionally used, but using the administrative order process, which would be a much more effective, a much more efficient process. So I think for monograph drugs that are sunscreens, you would have two choices today under this law. You could continue, as Mr. Warner said, to operate under the Sunscreen Innovation Act that Congress passed and implemented 4 years ago, or you could elect to operate under the new monograph structure. And I think long-term new ingredients would all be utilizing the new structure. So it's very positive for sunscreens.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Warner, I did hear your testimony. You mentioned the need for new over-the-counter review process to be flexible enough to accommodate sunscreen and how sunscreen active ingredients are slightly different than, say, Advil or Tylenol. Could you explain that?
Sure, thank you. First of all, yes, the new over-the-counter process has to be flexible enough to accommodate sunscreens. And a couple of big reasons that those are different is, number one, the new drug application process isn't really feasible for sunscreen products for any number of reasons, but not the least of which is that that would give you an approval for a final product and a final formulation. And sunscreens, sunscreen ingredients are used in lots of different products, number one. And number two, sunscreens typically change with seasons. They might change their scent, they might change their lotion, etc. So the process has to provide for an alternative pathway to approval in the OTC space besides the new drug application, and the draft legislation certainly does that. The other thing is, just like current law, sunscreen manufacturers should be able to use their safety and efficacy data from elsewhere around the world where the products are being used as part of their application package to demonstrate safety and effectiveness for the FDA purpose. That's another way that the products are slightly different, and it's another way that this legislation absolutely accommodates those products.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Roth, in your testimony, you mentioned that contract manufacturing organizations may specialize in unique dosage forms. Yes. Can you please explain this process further and explain how that process would be affected by over-the-counter monograph reform?
Well, some CMOs essentially work in traditional dosage form models, and a great portion of the market is comprised by those. But other ones do work in unique dosage forms in semi-solids and other topical delivery systems, et cetera. And for some of those types of dosages, it's possible that innovations in the monograph might lead to products that they would then be open to manufacturing, where just changing the type of pill might not be as big an innovation. So for a niche technology provider like some of our member companies, this could open the door to new OTC monograph products that they would produce for their customers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Ms. Moore and Mr. Melville, one of the discussed benefits of the over-the-counter monograph reform has been potential for streamlined regulatory process to encourage innovation in the OTC drug market. The discussion draft also proposes an additional market incentive that would provide 24 months of exclusivity to an innovative over-the-counter product. The committee has supported targeted exclusivity in certain product areas as a way to create a market where one doesn't exist, such as in, for instance, antibiotics, or in areas where we want to engender greater competition, such as with the generic drug products. Whether or not this incentive was the right incentive in these examples, the exclusivity was crafted with a clear public goal in mind. My question to Ms. Moore is that I mentioned the discussion draft would propose awarding 24 months of exclusivity to innovative over-the-counter products, a vastly longer period than the 180 days awarded to the first generic market entrants, or the 6 months provided by the pharmaceutical manufacturers who complete the necessary pediatric studies. In considering market exclusivity for all over-the-counter products, what public health considerations could Congress have in mind to ensure that there's a proper balance between that innovation and public health? A very long question.
I think that well, first, just to pause and reflect that the current draft is really a well-thought-through compromise on the part of a lot of parties, so we appreciate that. I think that the issue of exclusivity is always one of the more sensitive issues in this kind of legislation, and we appreciate the fact that different goals and different benefits have been evaluated under different types of legislation. I think in this case for over-the-counter products, because we are hoping to spur a fair amount of innovation in this marketplace, it would be worthwhile. We understand that Congress and industry and other stakeholders have agreed to a certain timetable. I think it would be worthwhile to evaluate whether that timetable, that 2 years, as you point out, really is striking the right balance between spurring innovation for products that could improve health and actually improving patients' access to products that can improve their health.
Okay. Thank you. Much shorter answer than the question. Mr. Melville, I heard from members in your industry that exclusivity is warranted for OTC monograph. products in order to justify paying user fees, or alternatively, that regardless of the streamlining of the Monograph's process, that through executive order, there would still not be sufficient incentive for companies to innovate. Setting aside whether or not exclusivity is a proper incentive, what is the public health justification for awarding 24 months of exclusivity to an over-the-counter product? It seems to me that this long of a period has a potential for blocking patient access to new formulations that would increase or encourage patient utilization and adherence.
So, Mr. Green, I think one of the great benefits of the over-the-counter drug industry and the products that our members bring to market is it gives consumers a choice. They can choose a branded product. They can choose a store brand product. The average price of one of our products is under $8. So they're very, very affordable products. The Monograph system is currently in force, deals with drugs and with ingredients that have been on the market, as been said earlier, since 1972. There hasn't been a lot of innovation. To spur innovation, a manufacturer would have to come to the table with essential human data. Data that the drug will work on humans, will be safe and effective on humans. That's very costly. And if you don't give a period of exclusivity to reward the innovator, the next day there could be a private label version of that product on the market. Mr. Chairman, our association represents both branded manufacturers and private label manufacturers. In fact, our chairman right now is the business head for the largest store brand manufacturer in the United States. They are strongly supportive of 2 years of exclusivity because they recognize the investment that it takes to innovate, and they recognize that that is their future pipeline and that consumers will benefit from that, so they'll have a choice.
Thank you. Like my colleagues, I also want to encourage the regulatory reform. The over-the-counter drug market is appropriately encouraging innovation. However, we consider incentives such as market exclusivity. It's almost like an issue in our subcommittee. We must also ensure that our desire for innovation does not overtake the need for the patient access. Mr. Roth, we work closely with the contract manufacturing organizations and contract development and manufacturing organizations to make OTC user fees are appropriate, tailored to those specific types of companies. Can you elaborate on how the fee model in our discussion draft reflects the differential value of OTC products to CMOs and to CDMOs?
Certainly. It's a result of conversations we've had internally within industry that reflects the much lower margins that CMOs have, particularly when it comes to working with OTC products, even in relation to the prescription and generic products that they manufacture. So in working with our industry partners, we developed a tiering model that we think would better reflect the respective values that a CMO accrues from this, both from the products and from this program overall, in comparison with the private label and the store marketing companies. Does that answer your question?
I think that's pretty close. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm running out of time.
You are correct. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I'll open it up for whoever wants to jump in here, but the first question is, and it's all pretty simple stuff, is there anything that we have in the discussion draft that causes you all concern? Anybody? You can start whichever end, or whoever is passionate and wants to jump in first. Anybody have any concerns?
I don't think so.
Dr. Jones?
No.
Okay. Anything in that we...
Sir?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
I do, we strongly support having explicit authority for FDA over packaging, and that is in the statute. The specific language and how it can be applied, I think, is still being discussed.
Okay.
There are 3 ways that FDA can apply some of the new authorities that it gets under the statute. It can act under an imminent hazard and move very, very quickly to remove a product from market. There is some interim order authority that it can use to update labeling, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned earlier. We strongly support that. Then there's the traditional administrative order process, which is a great enhancement over current law and allows for a period of public discussion before an order would take effect. We believe packaging decisions, because they are very complex, require that sort of discussion before they would take effect. So we think the packaging authority should be limited to the administrative order process.
All right, and that's helpful to know. That's why I asked the question, so thank you. And then the second half of that question is there something that you think we ought to have in there that's not in there? And the part of that goes back to what you were saying, Mr. Melville. Anybody else have something that they think we ought to put on the table to discuss while we're, because it sounds like that there's a bipartisan agreement by most members of at least the subcommittee that we've got to do something. So let's make sure we cover all the bases that we can. Anybody have anything that we should put into the discussion draft that's not currently there?
Well,
Mr. Warren.
yes, as we said in our testimony, we do think that it would be useful if we could incorporate some way to assess testing standards. And for sunscreens, the FDA has published guidance on this, and certainly the bill goes a long way towards by guaranteeing meetings between sponsors and the agency. That's going to go a long way toward coming to some kind of agreement about what the appropriate standards are. But since this is such a new, this is such a new area, we thought it would be appropriate for there to be some way, perhaps upon reauthorization of the bill, that we could evaluate how that's going.
All right, I appreciate that. Dr. Jones, I'm going to switch gears and turn to you in a slightly different vein, having asked my two questions on this subject. Appreciate what you do. I have a now 11-year-old who has been under an allergist care since he was about 4 months old. Got all kinds of issues going on. And so I would have to say, while in a perfect world, and appreciated your comments about making sure things are tested on kids, every kid's a little bit different, as I'm sure you're aware. And I'm sure that at some point you've used off-label drugs because you couldn't find something else that would work for that particular child. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Although there's been significant strides in the ability to study drugs in children over the last several years with BPCA and PREA, as pediatricians, we still know that 50 to 60% of the drugs that we currently have to use in children are used off-label. So we do not have direct evidence that tells us the dosage for those medications and whether those medications are actually effective. But when you see a child with a certain condition and you know that this drug has some evidence that it may work in adults or other populations, then you're somewhat forced to use those medications in off-label situations. But I think with BPCA and PREA, we're making significant strides, and I hope that that will continue.
And it's always good to get more information from whatever source you can to make sure that you're using that off-label drug when you have to in the best way that you can. Isn't that also correct?
Yes, I think as any medical provider, it's your due diligence to your patients to make sure that you have combed the literature and done as much research as you can when you have to make that difficult decision in using off-label medications.
And I only have time for a yes or no, but more information is better than less information, yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And Dr. Jones, appreciated your testimony. And I do seem to recall maybe 2 or 3 years ago a difficulty with the labeling of infant preparations of acetaminophen and a child being given a child's dose of the infant concentration actually paradoxically, it seems, the infant preparation was more potent or more concentrated than the one that was labeled for children. And I believe there were some therapeutic misadventures with acetaminophen because of that concentration difference. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And one of the things that we might strive to avoid in the future would be just that type of confusion that a new parent might encounter. This is what I've been giving to my infant. Now that they're larger, I'll give them a child's dose of the infant preparation, and it wouldn't be appropriate.
Yes, I think that's a very great example. So for acetaminophen, as pediatricians, we know what the correct dose is for that medication, but due to limitations with being able to add language to the monograph, we cannot put that information on the packaging and on the labeling. So if a child is less than 2 years of age, it simply says contact your healthcare provider to provide how to dose that medication. So if you're a parent in the middle of the night and your baby has a fever and they're less than 2 years of age, you do not have any instructions there that tell you how to dose that medication. And so that's when you get into safety issues where a parent might have to guess the dose if they're not able to contact their healthcare provider, or they may have to take their child out in the middle of the night to an emergency room so they can be dosed. So I think that those are significant safety concerns that hopefully will be addressed with this new legislation.
Yeah, it'd be my hope as well. And Dr. Jones and Mr. Melville, you both referenced the cross-jurisdiction of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I think Dr. Woodcock mentioned it as well. And clearly that's one of the things that will have to be taken into account. I had not even considered that the dispensing mechanism, being a gummy bear, would pose a special challenge as far as the packaging is concerned, and clearly it would. So that is, Mr. Melville, just gets to your point. One of the reasons we're here today is we do have to be nimble. We do have to be much more agile, or the regulatory agency needs to be much more agile than it's currently capable of being at the monographs.
If I could follow up,
Please.
I think Dr. Jones makes a great point, and pediatric acetaminophen is a great example. Our industry petitioned the FDA to add under 2 labeling on the label, and FDA wasn't able to move forward quickly on that because of the notice and comment rulemaking requirement under the current monograph system. So today it does not exist. But our industry did move forward, and the 2 concentrations of acetaminophen that Dr. Jones referred to were both permitted under the monograph. The industry voluntarily withdrew one of those because they saw in real world that there was some confusion. So there's only 1 concentration today, and it's the more diluted concentration. We also voluntarily added flow restrictors to pediatric acetaminophen so that children, if they did get into a bottle that was open, that was not sealed appropriately, would not be able to get a lethal dose of that. So the industry has moved forward to innovate, to make sure, to improve the safety of these products. It's a work in progress for sure, and we look forward to the new authority that FDA would have so that we can work with them and get some of these improvements and make sure that they're applied not just voluntarily, but to all participants in the industry.
Well, and it begs the question, because you brought up about cumbersome activity of the rule and comment type of structure that we're in now. So it made me wonder, in the future, is there going to be an app for that?
Who knows? Technology is certainly changing things. I mean, certainly today, consumers have to look at the label to get all the information they need to be able to use that product safely. And with technology and advances, are there uses of technology that can enhance the safety, add different labels, have a hologram that maybe has multiple languages? There are certain, I think the sky the options are limitless for using technology to enhance the safe use of over-the-counter medicines. And we look forward to working with FDA on those initiatives.
And as every do-it-yourselfer knows, there's frequently a YouTube video on just how to provide the instruction that you need.
And that concerns us greatly.
I'm sure that it does. It opens another avenue. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I do want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. I see no further members wishing to ask questions. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 10 business days of receipt of those questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.